dignity doesn't vanish when it's ignored. It waits in silence, stronger than ever. How much does it really take to see someone for who they are? A name? A medal? Or just the courage to look a little closer? Let us know in the comment section below, and don't forget to subscribe if you believe stories like this matter. The man who walked into Terminal C didn't fit the scenery, and that's exactly how he liked it. Rick Stanton didn't wear his medals, didn't carry any sign of who he was. He wore a plain tan windbreaker, a faded green duffel that had been stitched up twice, and the quiet kind of presence that made people step aside without realizing why. He moved like someone who had nothing to prove, but had already proved everything. The only clue to the life behind his lined, clean-shaven face was a worn patch on his bag, the Special Forces crest, its edges fraying like an old flag that refused to fall apart, and his eyes, gray, not cold, but distant, scanned everything like it all mattered, like it might change, like it could still hurt. He approached the check-in kiosk without a word, pulled out his ID, and typed in his confirmation number. It was supposed to be a short flight from Dallas to D.C. first class, booked by the event coordinators who never quite understood that Rick would have rather taken a Greyhound. He wasn't going for himself. He was going because they were honoring his old unit, and because Catherine, his wife of 37 years, had insisted. He'd chuckled, muttering something about dog and pony shows and speeches he didn't want to hear, but she'd only smiled, gently taking his hand and saying, "It's not about speeches, Rick. It's about showing up. For them, not for you." He was still thinking about that when the gate agent called his name over the loudspeaker. "Passenger Stanton, please see the attendant at gate C-14. Rick blinked. No one had ever said please like that in uniform. Light, perfunctory, like the sir that came with a fake smile. Still, he adjusted the strap on his duffel and walked over. Behind the desk stood a young man with gelled hair, a shiny blue vest, and a forced professionalism that cracked the second he looked up from his monitor. "Mr. Stanton?" the agent asked, tone clipped. Rick nodded. "I'm afraid there's been an equipment swap. The aircraft was downgraded, and unfortunately first-class seating has been reduced. We've had to reassign some passengers." Rick said nothing. The agent looked up, hesitant now. "You've been reassigned to 32B? That's a middle seat, economy." It took a moment for the words to land. Not because Rick didn't understand them, he just couldn't believe how easily they were said. A middle seat, economy. After being ticketed in first. After giving nearly his entire life to a country that sent him to hell and back more than once. He didn't scowl, didn't raise his voice, didn't lean forward with indignation. Instead, Rick just asked one question. "Why me?" The agent flinched a little, then checked his screen again. It's a randomized algorithm, sir. Priority based on elite status and, well, you're not in our loyalty program." Rick didn't laugh, though it almost felt like a joke. "No, I suppose I'm not," he said. He stepped back. Other passengers passed him, some brushing past, some glancing sideways at the old man with the soldier's posture, and nothing but silence in his hands. Rick walked away, not toward the gate, but toward a quieter row of chairs where no one was sitting. He sat, pulled out his phone, looked at a number he hadn't dialed in over a year, the Veterans Hero Support Line. A desk most people didn't even know existed inside the airline's corporate structure. The last time he called, it was to help reroute a Marine's remains to his widow in time for the burial. It wasn't a number he used lightly, but this time wasn't about anger. It was about something else, something that had less to do with a middle seat and more to do with what it meant to live in a country that could forget you the moment you took the uniform off. Rick hit call. Meanwhile, 2 rows behind the counter, a flight attendant named Carly Jacobs was watching everything unfold. She'd worked for the airline for 9 years. Enough time to know that equipment swaps happened, that chaos sometimes got handled by computers with no memory of people, But what she saw in Rick Stanton's face wasn't frustration. It was heartbreak wrapped in discipline, and it stayed with her even as she boarded early to prep for the flight. Rick, still seated alone, finally got an answer. Heroes Liaison, this is Daryl Mendoza speaking. How can I help? Rick didn't introduce himself like most callers. He didn't have to. I need you to pull up passenger Stanton. American Airlines, Flight 202, 8 to D.C. A pause. Yes, sir. Confirming. Colonel Richard Stanton. Another pause. Rick didn't confirm or deny. He just said, I'm not calling for me. I'm calling because someone needs to know what your algorithms don't. 10 minutes passed. At gate C-14, the agent who had reassigned him froze when his terminal locked mid-check-in. Then the phone behind the desk rang. Twice, then a third time, and as he picked it up, trying to make out the muffled voice on the other end, his expression shifted. What started as confusion quickly warped into something else. Shock, because standing 30 feet away, slowly approaching with his blazer undone and a corporate badge still clipped to his belt, was Thomas Adler, president of the airline. The people at the gate didn't recognize him, but the gate agent did. So did Carly, still inside the cabin, watching through the window. Rick Stanton, seated quietly with his bag in his lap, didn't even look up. Not yet, but something had just shifted. Something big. The president's shoes clicked against the polished terminal floor, too expensive, too deliberate, like someone used to walking into rooms where his voice changed things. But Thomas Adler was out of place here, and he knew it. The boarding area wasn't a boardroom. There were no catered lattes or polished glass tables, only tired travelers, missed connections, and the faint buzz of vending machines. He hadn't planned on being here, not really, but when Daryl Mendoza from the Heroes Liaison Desk called him directly, breaking chain-of-command protocol with only a single name and a flight number, something made him move. Colonel Richard Stanton. Mendoza had said, you downgraded him. Adler didn't know the name right away. That part shamed him. But the moment Darrow's voice added Medal of Honor recipient, sir, Delta Force, survived cullet, retired without scandal, teaches ROTC for free, something in Adler's gut twisted. He didn't ask why this man had been downgraded. He asked how fast he could get to the terminal. Now he stood there just feet from where Rick sat. The older man hadn't noticed him yet, or maybe he had and simply didn't care. That was something Adler had been warned about. Rick Stanton wasn't a man who demanded respect. He was the kind who gave it until it wasn't returned, and then took his dignity elsewhere. Adler's voice caught in his throat before he spoke, but then it came low, measured, almost too quiet for the bustle around them. Colonel Stanton. Rick looked up slowly, his eyes locking with Adler's without recognition or interest. Adler extended his hand. Thomas Adler, president of Sky Atlantic Airlines. Rick looked at the hand. He didn't shake it. You're here about the seat, he said, voice level. Adler nodded. Rick gestured toward the mostly empty row beside him. Go ahead and sit. I don't stand for apologies. That made Adler blink. But he sat. For a moment neither spoke. Overhead a woman called for final boarding for another flight. A child cried. A suitcase wheel squeaked. Then Adler said, I'm sorry. Rick raised one eyebrow. Adler continued, We failed you. The equipment change should have triggered a manual override for veteran honors. It didn't. Our system missed it. I missed it. Rick turned his head, finally meeting Adler's eyes directly. It's not about the seat. Adler tilted his head. Then what is it about? Rick's voice didn't change, but the weight behind it grew denser. It's about how fast people forget what we look like when we're not in uniform. How easy it is to downgrade someone when you don't recognize the quiet they carry. Adler swallowed. You're not invisible to us. Rick chuckled once, dryly. You just proved you are. Adler shifted, His rehearsed statements, crafted by PR and compliance officers, died in his throat. He realized something then. There was no recovering this with platitudes. Rick leaned back in his seat. "Do you know what it feels like to hold a man's hand as he dies?" he asked. "I don't mean the metaphor. I mean to feel the weight of a body give out right against you, to hear someone's last word and know it'll never be heard again." Adler didn't answer. Rick continued, "It's silence. That's what death really is. It's not dramatic or noble. It's just silent. I've sat in that silence more times than I can count. And now I'm sitting in a new kind of silence." Adler looked down at his shoes. "We have to fix this," he said. Rick nodded. "Yes, you do, but not for me." Adler looked at him, confused. Rick gestured to the terminal around them. "For the kid over there in a ball cap with his duffel. For the woman on crutches who just limped through security with a military ID around her neck. For the ones who don't have medals or names that get attention, but who still gave everything." Adler's throat tightened. Rick finally leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I didn't call that number to get my seat back. I called so someone like you could come down here and look at me. See the whole picture. Understand what it costs when dignity is replaced by algorithms." For the first time, Adler looked shaken. "Colonel Stanton, would you allow me to upgrade you back to first? Or move someone else to sit with you, if you prefer?" Rick didn't smile, but his voice softened. "Keep the middle seat. I'm not leaving it." Adler blinked. "Why?" "Because I want to know how it feels," Rick said. "To sit between two strangers and still hold your shoulders straight. To remember that I can still endure what others think is uncomfortable. I've done worse for less." Adler nodded, slowly understanding. Then Rick added, "But what I'm asking, is for you to go back to your boardroom and change the damn policy." Adler's face settled into something more serious. "I can do that." Rick stood, lifting his bag. "Good." Adler remained seated, watching him walk toward the gate with slow, measured steps. Carly Jacobs, still prepping the cabin, turned just as Rick boarded. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw where he sat. 32B, between a man in business casual and a teenage girl with earbuds. He didn't say anything, just gave him a quiet nod as he passed. Rick nodded back and sat down in the middle seat, like it meant something. Because for him it did. The man to Rick's left was a pharmaceutical rep named Jared, late 30s, Bluetooth always in one ear, the kind of traveler who complained about legroom while taking 2 armrests. To Rick's right, the teenage girl hadn't looked up once since he sat down, earbuds in, thumbs flicking across a cracked phone screen with blistering speed. He didn't mind the silence. He welcomed it. Silence, after all, had been the company of ghosts, and Rick had learned long ago how to breathe in it without feeling alone. The boarding process dragged on. Someone struggled with an overhead bin, a baby cried 4 rows up, the intercom buzzed alive with a flight attendant's forced smile of a voice. Rick leaned back and closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen. He could hear tension long before anyone else saw it. He'd done that in Kandahar, in Baghdad, and once in a hostile village where a farmer's eyes gave away the ambush before it began. Now, in the quiet hum of row 32, he felt something similar. Not danger, but weight. Not his own. It was coming from the girl beside him. He turned slightly, not to intrude, but to observe. Her knee bounced, rapid and erratic, a drumbeat of nerves. Her hand trembled every time she unlocked the phone. She wore a hoodie that hung low over her face, but Rick had seen enough scared young soldiers to know what fear looked like, even when it wore earbuds and tick-tock. "You okay?" he asked gently, voice pitched low. She startled, looked up with wide eyes, removed one earbud. "What? You okay?" he repeated. She gave a half nod, then shrugged. "Yeah, just Rick nodded and turned back. Didn't push. 3 minutes passed. Then she said, I don't like flying. Rick didn't look at her, just replied, A lot of people don't. I've done it hundreds of times. Still not my favorite. Her brow furrowed. Were you a pilot? No, Rick said. Cargo, and other things. She seemed to chew on that. I'm Skylar, she said after a pause. Rick. They sat another moment in silence. Then Skylar leaned in, speaking under her breath like a confession. I'm going to see my dad. He's in a VA hospital in Maryland. I haven't seen him in 4 years. Rick's eyes softened. Was he military? She nodded. Yeah, Marine Corps. Did tours in Fallujah, I think. Or maybe Afghanistan. We didn't talk much. Then he got hurt and kind of disappeared. Rick didn't ask why they hadn't spoken. He knew how war could turn fathers into echoes, into men who sat in dark rooms with unspoken nightmares and too many unopened letters. He reached out last month, she said. Said he's ready to talk. Said he's sorry. Rick nodded. That takes a lot. Both the call and the visit. Skylar gave him a look. You always sit in the middle seat and do therapy? Rick smiled. Just a little. No, just sometimes the seat picks you. That earned a chuckle. You're weird. I've been called worse, Rick said. From the front of the plane the curtain rustled. Carly Jacobs peeked out, scanning the rows. Her eyes landed on Rick, and for a second she hesitated. Then she stepped into the aisle and made her way back. Mr. Stanton? She said softly. Rick looked up. Could I speak to you for a moment, up front? Rick unbuckled and rose. As he did, Jared huffed dramatically, having to tuck his laptop away to let him out. Rick moved past him without a word. Skylar watched him go, curiosity written across her face. In the galley, Carly closed the curtain behind them. I just wanted to say I saw what happened. At the gate, she said, and what you said to the airline president. Rick looked at her but said nothing. Carly swallowed. My brother, he served. Army. Kunar province. He came home and said nothing ever felt real again, like people were playing house, pretending the world wasn't burning. Rick nodded slowly. Didn't make it 2 years, she said. OD'd. Didn't tell anyone he needed help. Rick's posture straightened. I see you, sir. I just wanted you to know that. And I'm sorry for how they treated you. Rick's voice came low. I appreciate that. Carly's eyes watered, but she wiped them quickly. They wanted me to ask if you'd like to be moved back to first class. The seat's open now. President Adler made sure of it. Rick shook his head. No, I'm where I need to be. Carly smiled through the emotion. Of course, just thank you. Rick offered a quiet nod, then turned and walked back to row 32. As he slid back into the middle seat, Jared groaned again and exaggerated the effort of letting him through. Should have kept walking, Jared muttered. Rick looked at him and said nothing. Skylar leaned toward him as he sat. What was that about? Nothing important, Rick said. She studied him. You're somebody, huh? Rick smiled faintly. We all are. Just takes the right seat to show it. And with that, the engines roared to life. Rick Stanton folded his hands in his lap, centered between a man who saw himself as the main character and a girl still deciding if she was brave enough to meet her past. In that narrow row, 32B didn't feel small anymore. It felt right. They touched down in Washington just after dusk, the sky outside bleeding orange behind the trees, the horizon soft with humidity. As passengers gathered their belongings, the usual ritual of polite aggression unfolded. Seatbelts clicked, overhead bins popped, and everyone tried to stand at once. But Rick stayed seated, calm in the chaos. He'd learned long ago that rushing wasn't the same as arriving. Skylar hadn't said much during the flight after their brief exchange, but she didn't plug her earbuds back in either. Instead, she glanced at Rick every now and then, the way someone watches the ocean, Not sure why it's comforting, only that it is. When it was finally their Rose turn to move, Jared shoved past them with a muttered complaint about inefficiency and amateurs. Rick didn't even blink. He stood slowly, lifting Skylar's bag from the overhead before she could reach for it. She looked up at him. "Thanks." Rick nodded. As they stepped onto the jet bridge, a pair of airline staffers were waiting. Not agents, not TSA, corporate suits. One of them held a clipboard, the other had a phone pressed to his ear. Behind them, a woman stood with a placard in hand. Not just any placard, a welcome sign. "Welcome home, Colonel Stanton. Thank you for your service." Rick stopped in his tracks. It wasn't a spectacle, no cameras, no news crews, no speeches, just presence and respect. The staffers moved to the side, clearing a path. And standing at the end of that path, just past the gate, was a tall man in a dark civilian suit. Wide shoulders, close-cropped hair, the look of someone who had once worn a uniform and never fully taken it off. "Rick." Rick blinked. His eyes adjusted. "Luis." Sergeant Luis Ortega stepped forward and pulled Rick into a firm embrace. It wasn't delicate. It was the kind of hug shared by men who had survived the same fire, who had carried each other out of places no one back home would ever understand. "You didn't tell me you were flying in today," Luis said, voice rough. "I had to hear it from an old buddy at the liaison office." Rick pulled back slightly, raising an eyebrow. "Didn't think I needed an escort." Luis grinned. "You don't, but I figured maybe you needed a friend." Skylar stood off to the side, holding her backpack close, watching. Luis noticed her and stepped over, extending a hand. "Luis Ortega. You with the colonel?" She hesitated, then shook his hand. "Kind of. I'm here to see my dad. He's at the VA hospital." Luis's smile softened. "Then you're with family." Rick looked at her, his voice quiet. "You gonna go?" She nodded. "Yeah, I think. I'm ready." Luis tilted his head. "What's your dad's name?" "Robert Mayfield." Luis blinked. "Mayfield?" Skylar froze. "You know him?" "Sure do. We served in the same battalion for 2 tours. That man saved my life in Kandahar." He turned to Rick. "We called him Quiet Rob. Didn't talk much, but when he did, everyone listened." Skylar's lips trembled. She didn't speak. Luis gently touched her shoulder. "He's been asking about you. Told the nurse last week he wished he'd had the courage to call sooner." She nodded, blinking rapidly. "I thought he forgot me." "Never," Luis said. "He's just been living with ghosts. We all do." Rick stepped forward and handed her his business card. It was plain, just a number and a name. No title, no rank. "You call me if you need anything at all." Skylar took the card like it weighed something sacred. Luis looked at Rick. "Before you leave, there's one more thing." They walked together past security through a private hallway not marked for public access. The walls were lined with framed black and white photos, portraits of pilots, stewardesses from the 60S, engineers, and even photos of fallen airline employees who had served in wars past. Rick paused at one image. A photo of a young black soldier in Vietnam, smiling despite the mud on his face. Louise opened a door at the end of the hallway. Inside was a quiet room, small, windowless, with leather chairs and a single flag hanging on the back wall. A plaque had just been mounted, Sky Atlantic Honor Seat Program, dedicated to Medal of Honor recipients and distinguished veterans. May this seat never be forgotten, never be downgraded, and never fly empty. Rick stared at the plaque, then at the empty seat beneath it. A first-class seat, mounted to the floor like an exhibit. Beside it, a case held a replica Medal of Honor, encased in glass. Louise said nothing. Rick reached out and ran his fingers over the smooth leather armrest, then stepped back. "I didn't ask for this," he said quietly. "I know," Louis replied, but you earned it anyway." Rick looked up at the flag. Let the silence hang there. Let it speak for the names not carved in wood, for the men who never made it home, for the women who fought beside them and still fight after the war ends. He turned back to Luis. "Make sure Skylar gets to her, Dad." Luis nodded. "Already on it." Rick walked out of the room, down the corridor, through the terminal, where people were too busy rushing to notice the man who had once parachuted behind enemy lines with nothing but a radio and a rifle. But one little girl did. As she walked with her mother toward baggage claim, she looked up at Rick and whispered, "Mommy, was that a soldier?" Her mother glanced over, smiled softly, and said, "Yes, baby, I think he still is." Rick didn't hear her. But if he had, he would have just kept walking, head high, posture straight, not because of pride, but because walking steady was how you carried the ones who no longer could. Outside the terminal, Catherine waited at the curb, wrapped in a navy shawl, arms crossed against the breeze. She saw him before he saw her, and when their eyes met, she smiled. "First class treat you well?" she teased. Rick stepped forward, kissed her on the forehead, and said, "Middle seat. Best one I've ever had." And as they drove off into the D.C. evening, the plaque inside the terminal caught the last rays of sunlight through a glass wall, the engraved letters casting long, noble shadows on the floor. Because sometimes the apology doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to land.